So this issue of licensing works perfectly with that. Licensing is where the government mandates fees, hours, or education in order for someone to work, or another way of putting it, where people need the government's permission in order to go out and hold a job. There are three main issues in labor economics across the nation. One is unionization, one is minimum wage, and one is licensing. And generally, if you look across the states, there are more people that are required to hold a license in order to work than there are people in labor unions or people that are affected by minimum wage laws. So it's not an exaggeration to say that licensing is the largest issue in labor economics. And unlike minimum wage and unionization, the economic literature on licensing is fairly unanimous. There's wide agreement from people, everyone from the Obama administration to the Koch brothers, and everyone in between. So there's agreement that licensing raises the cost for consumers, it raises barriers of entry for people, it causes higher unemployment, and it causes lost jobs. So what can we do about that here in Michigan and states around the nation? Lee McGrath is a managing attorney. He's with a group called the Institute for Justice. The Institute for Justice is a premier national public interest law firm. They work in the areas of eminent domain, forfeiture, licensing, and school choice. They represent clients across the nation, all the way up to the Supreme Court level. Lee's going to talk about some of the cases that have been going on, some of the actual licensing rules, and how Michigan compares to other states. So please welcome Lee McGrath with the Institute for Justice.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It is a great pleasure to be back in Lansing. When we last talked, I was on a panel with the ACLU and Representative Irwin, and I can tell you that what brought left and right together about reforming forfeiture laws was successful. Here in Michigan, you last year enacted a terrific reporting bill. You changed the standard of proof. And so my hope is that today I can work with the Mackinac Center to plant another seed about freedom, and that is the freedom to pursue one's calling. Now, the good news is that, as Jared suggested, is that the academic research supports reducing the role of occupational licensing in Michigan. And the really good news is that the United States Supreme Court has given state legislators a real hammer, the fear of being sued by antitrust lawyers, to enact some of these reforms. So today I am going to be talking about what occupational licensing is and expanding upon some of the initial observations that Jared made, and then giving you some insight into what exactly the United States Supreme Court has done and how best can Michigan legislators use that to enact positive, good public policy as it relates to freeing labor markets so that people can pursue their dreams. So today's presentation has some alternative titles. 5 Supreme Court justices just made the job of lobbyists for trade associations a lot harder. America's biggest labor institution is going to be changed by antitrust lawyers. And the Supreme Court has invited you to do the most important labor development since right to work, and you should go for it. My agenda today is to give you a very quick overview of what the Institute for Justice does, give you some perspectives on what occupational licensing is, put some meat on the bones that Jared has presented, spend a good amount of time on the North Carolina Dental Board case, and offer some solutions to the problem that lawsuit has brought upon the state of Michigan in terms of losing the licensing board's immunity from antitrust litigation. So at the Institute for Justice, we defend people's right to speak freely, to own property, to pursue their callings, particularly as it relates to barriers to entry. We're particularly skeptical about regulations that block entry. It's one thing to regulate a process, it's something completely different in our eyes to regulate entry. And then we defend school choice programs, such as vouchers and scholarships and tax credits. Let's dive into occupational licensing. As Jared said, occupational licensing is the biggest issue in labor economics today. It is significantly the biggest issue in labor economics today, in that across the country, about 1 out of every 4 people needs the government's permission to pursue their calling, or about 25% of Americans need a license to work. In Michigan, it's a little lower, 21%, but you can see that it is bigger than unionism. That what has happened over the last 50 years is that the participation in unions has declined from about 40% in the 1950s to about 11% today. Michigan, it's about 15, 16%. By contrast, over that same time period, in the 50s, where only doctors and lawyers and barbers were licensed, now in Michigan, more than 20% of Michiganders are licensed. Both these numbers are enormous compared to what gets a lot of debate, the minimum wage. Less than 1% of workers earn the minimum wage. In fact, less than 5% of hourly workers earn the minimum wage. So if legislators want to affect a labor institution that has a significant cost to workers, it should focus on occupational licensing. It's big. It is costly. What is a license? A license is a barrier to entry. The state is saying that in order to pursue your calling, you first have to hurdle over certain barriers. Well, not everyone is going to be able to hurdle over those barriers. Even qualified people aren't going to be able to hurdle over those barriers. And when the state sets up its 150 or so licenses, what will happen is that fewer people will be able to work. And when you have fewer people working, you have higher unemployment. So just a back-of-the-envelope estimate on extrapolating from other statistics is that Michigan's licensing laws cost about 25,000 jobs. About 0.5% to 1% of the workforce could be working if there were fewer licensing laws in Michigan. Well, when you shrink the available pool of providers, one other thing happens. Prices go up. The price for services that are facing fewer competitors goes up, and it goes up, interestingly, about the same amount that unionism causes labor rates to go up, about 15%. And so on a national basis, that costs American citizens, that reduction, about $200 billion, or roughly $1,000 per family, and an estimate of about $6 billion a year paid annually because of this reduced supply of providers to Michigan consumers. So it's big and it's costly. There are some regulatory problems. Licensing exists. It is designed. Its purpose is to be anti-competitive. It is born out of the idea that government can reduce competition, and that reduction only occurs by those who are incompetent and fraudulent. Well, I think there's little evidence to that, but the whole idea of licensing is that you put experts in a room and they weed out the incompetence and the fraud. So it comes out of this era of the 1930s. What happens is the trade associations and unions really like this because their members benefit from licensing, and they march up the steps of the Capitol and they say, please regulate me. Please regulate me. I want to be regulated. My trade association members want to be regulated. They want barriers to entry. And the second thing that comes out of their mouths is, and please grandfather in everyone who's currently working and apply the regulations only to the people who are teenagers and who are high school, who don't have any political clout and aren't showing up at the Capitol. Secondly, by definition, licensing boards are captured. It is the idea of putting experts in a room and letting them regulate their own profession. And worse is that the funding, most of the time, doesn't come through the appropriations process. The funding comes from licensing fees. And so therefore, the board's customers, its source of money, is not marching up the steps of the Capitol and going in front of the Appropriations Committee, but instead, it's the people who it regulates. And then finally, licensing boards. Another regulatory problem is that licensing boards regularly are very reluctant to revoke licenses. Proponents of licensing say, well, you need a place to go complain. Well, I am licensed by the state of Minnesota. I'm an attorney licensed by the Supreme Court of Minnesota. And so are 24,000 other people. And I'm convinced that at least 1% of all lawyers in the state of Minnesota are incompetent and they should lose their license. So I'm a big proponent of 240 people every year losing their license in the state of Minnesota. Last year, the Minnesota Supreme Court revoked the license of 8 people. I could be addicted to meth and not lose my license in the state of Minnesota. Now I can if I steal money from my clients, but the police chief should arrest me and send me to jail. It shouldn't be a function of the Minnesota Supreme Court to revoke my license there. So boards, that's an anecdote, but we've also looked at dentists in Iowa and doctors in Iowa. License boards do not perform what many people believe intuitively is this idea of revoking licenses. Licensing can be arbitrary. In addition to regulatory process, if you were in another Big Ten state like Iowa or Nebraska and you wanted to become a cosmetologist, you'd need 490 days of training. But the rest of the country only needs 372 days. So I give you license today to tease every Iowan you know about how bad their hair looks, even if their cosmetologists get almost a 33% increase in training. Michigan, somehow you survive with only 350 days of training, and the people in New York and Massachusetts have figured out how to have good hair days with only 233 days of training. Security guards, in the great state of Michigan, you require security guards to have 3 years of training. In 24 other states, you only need 10 days of training. So we looked at a study, we looked at 102 different licenses across all 50 states in our study called License to Work, and only 10 of these 102 were licensed in all 50 states. In other words, 92 were licensed in some but not all states. Michigan is only one of 8 states that licenses floor sanders contractors. You would think if there were an epidemic of negligent floor sanding that the other 42 states would license it. Only 13 states license locksmiths. Somehow in Michigan you have survived without licensing locksmiths. Don't license locksmiths. And I'm happy to give copies of the study to anyone who wishes. Licensing may not be tied to risk. Here's a third problem. It's arbitrary. It can be captured. Here's the third problem. In Michigan, it takes 56 times more training to be licensed as an athletic trainer than an EMT. So the man or woman who carries you out because these tacos just were so good that you ate too many of them and you're having a heart attack, that person only needs 26 days of training. Now, I'm not suggesting that the state increase the amount of training for EMTs. I'm suggesting that perhaps this reflects the Athletic Training Association's excessive lobbying of barriers to entry into that field. So licensing may also be unjust. Unionism tends to shrink the difference between high and low wage earners. Licensing exacerbates the difference. Licensing tends to transfer money from poor and working class people to wealthy people. It is reverse Robin Hood. So if any of advocates who are concerned about income disparity, income inequality, those advocates should not be fans of occupational licensing. Secondly, licensing is elitist in that it rewards people who have access to formal education and punishes those that don't. It does not reward learning on the job. It rewards getting a degree. And so the kid who starts off in a hospital as an orderly and gets the next job and gets the next job runs into a glass ceiling because the license stops him. He doesn't have the license, but he's learned on the job, he can certainly do the task. Licensing is particularly painful for those who want to change careers in midlife. For the woman who after raising children wants to go back into the workforce, she sees that licensing really is designed for 18-year-olds, that licensing is designed for those who have an expenditure, have lots of money and time to go get a formal education. And although she may have talents sufficient to do the job, she is fenced out by occupational licensing. Additionally, one of my favorite people in this area of economic liberty is Mrs. Obama. She has been instrumental for two reasons. One, the official one that I'll tell you about here, is that she was instrumental, and perhaps you've done this in Michigan, of blocking down increasing interstate mobility for people who, trailing spouses who move with their military service men from one state to another. Have you done that here? You've made interstate mobility recognition of licenses? At the committee level. All right. The second reason I love Mrs. Obama is that she violated the interior designer's license in Washington, D.C. Then when she redid redid the White House in 2007, she did not hire a licensed interior designer in the District of Columbia. She went out to California, found a high-end, famous interior designer, brought him back. He was not licensed in the District of Columbia. She hired him anyway, and he did some marvelous work. Supposedly, she has not been arrested or fined for breaking the DC's law. And then from a religious tradition, mine in particular, the obligation to earn one's bread presumes the right to do so. A society that denies this right cannot be just, nor can it attain social peace. So this is John Paul II. And those who defend licensing tend to do it from a rather paternalistic way. What they do is they identify some hypothetical person who's not too smart, who can be exploited. They never really give you the name of the person, the consumer, who they're concerned about, but it is always someone not as intelligent as all the friends in the circles that the defender travels in. So here's the most important slide in my presentation, lucky number 13. There is now so much information about people's reputation and the quality of work that they do that a piece of paper hanging on the wall that might have been issued 5, 10, 25 years ago adds no incremental value to consumer protection. What adds incremental value, what protects consumers, is your reputation. When you think about wanting to buy anything new, even getting medical services, what do? You don't look at the roster of who's been licensed. Perhaps you presume that. but you ask a friend who has a friend who has a friend who has some familiarity, or you go on Travel Advisor, or you go on Yelp, or you go on Uber, you look at sources of information other than the state to protect consumers. Or you ask the best consumer protection question that exists in the entire Western Hemisphere. How long have you been in business? Because if someone has been in business for 10 years, you know that they have you can infer that they have satisfied lots of customers. So real consumer protection comes from competition, reputation, and legal remedies. So here's the policy summary. Licensing is a high-cost, low-benefit policy for workers and consumers. There are regulatory problems as it relates to capture. It is arbitrary, EMTs versus athletic trainers, and in my eyes, it is unjust. Here's the political reality of occupational licensing. I believe that you cannot say that you are in favor of free markets and be for occupational licensing. I believe that you cannot say that you're in favor of limited government and be in favor of 150 boards and the ability to control who enters the field. I believe that you can't say that you believe in economic liberty and opportunity and be in favor of licensing. And I believe you cannot say that you're in favor of social justice and put these type of barriers in front of people. So that's why I think it's bad. Let me tell you the reasons, give you an example of what you can do. I suggest on a going forward basis, legislators think about this in a completely different way. Today, the viewpoint that you hear from lobbyists is free markets or licensing. It's binary. It's either off or it's on. It's white or it's black. There are alternative ways for you to think about it, and let me give you a menu of regulatory alternatives. The first is when that lobbyist comes into your office and says, Representative, we should license X. We should create a new license for X. Your response should be, well, let's slow down. Let's slow down. Let's think about this. What are we trying to protect? What fault is there that you're concerned about? Where is the market failing that you think regulation is justified? So, make the lobbyist identify where market competition is failing and why setting up a cause of action in either district court or small claims court doesn't solve the problem. Representative Glenn, he says, but that doesn't, being able to sue in small claims court, that doesn't help. We've got problems of fraud. Don't go to licensing. Enhance the Attorney General's power. Bolster the Deceptive Trade Practices Act. There is nothing more fearful than being sued by the Attorney General over fraud. Use this regulatory tool. Postpone using licensing. Still concerned? You're concerned about cleanliness? I'm happy. Inspections is your right regulatory answer. That's the tool in the toolbox for you if you're concerned about cleanliness. As a hardcore libertarian, I will admit to you that I am happy that the city of Lansing inspects the cleanliness of restaurants in the city. I'm also glad that they don't license the busboy, the cook, or the dishwasher, that the proper regulatory response to cleanliness is inspections. I'd prefer that the city of Lansing just inspect that blue liquid that the barbers put their combs in, as opposed to causing people to go to 1,800 hours of training, because all I really care about is the cleanliness of the combs. So an inspection regime would be better than licensing barbers. Not enough? You're concerned about externalities. You're concerned about the tree trimmer who's cutting down the tree and the limb falls on your neighbor's garage and crushes it. The proper regulatory response to that fear is not a license, as the city of Minneapolis uses. It is to require bonding, as the city of Minneapolis also requires. Bonding is the way to deal with potential damages to third parties. You're concerned after a tornado or a hurricane that a bunch of roofers from shoddy roofers from Oklahoma are going to come up here and exploit the situation, the panic over destruction from natural causes. The right regulatory response is not to license, but make everyone register name and address and where they're served with the Secretary of State. Certification. Let me take a moment here and develop this idea. I'm going to compare certification to licensing, and I'm going to suggest that certification can do a heck of a lot of the heavy lifting that people often say only licensing does. One of the classic reasons for regulation rationales is this idea of asymmetrical information, that the seller knows more about the service than the buyer. And the classic example is the used car, that the car dealer knows a lot more about the quality of that car on the lot than the buyer does. So what does Ford and GM do? They certify the cars as being A1 quality. They give a warranty. Certification is like that. Certification is a titling act. And so if Jared and I are both in the business of doing X, and the consumer wants to choose between Jared and me, but the consumer doesn't know anything about the quality of Jared's or my services, the state of Michigan can offer Jared the opportunity to become certified, to earn the adjective certified, to use it in his marketing materials. Now, I don't want to jump through that hoop because I've got 30 years of experience doing X and my reputation is strong. But the problem of asymmetrical information between buyer and seller can be eliminated by a titling act where that buyer can say, Jared's been certified by the state of Michigan, either using its own criteria or private criteria, and can choose Jared because he has voluntarily jumped to the hoop. And the beauty of this is that Jared and I will continue to compete against each other. There won't be monopolistic benefits as there are in licensing. There won't be higher unemployment, but consumers can get a signal if they want one from the state or a private organization. So my suggestion to legislators is when lobbyists come in and say, please license me, it's better than no license, your response should be, well, wait a second, we have an entire menu of regulatory alternatives, and find the one that best aligns with the consumer protection. Let's show a video.
My name is Melanie Armstrong. Every day, hundreds of low-income families are housed because of my work, but I don't run a shelter. They are clothed through what I've done, but I don't run a secondhand clothing store. They are fed because of what I achieve, but I don't run a soup kitchen. I've transformed the lives of hundreds of poor women in my state of Mississippi, not because I sought out government assistance, rather because I asked the government to get out of my way. And if a lawn braider in Tupelo, Mississippi could have such a transformative impact, helping to change the law to free so many around to earn an honest living, imagine what could happen across our nation if state and local governments followed that example.
That powerful testimony was delivered by Melanie Armstrong, a braider from Mississippi, who along with the Institute for Justice fought and won her right to braid free from an unnecessary cosmetology license. Licensing laws don't just affect braiders. Today, nearly 1 in 3 Americans needs a license to work. The fight for braiding freedom benefits all these workers. Because of Melanie, 1,000 braiders in Mississippi are now free to earn an honest living. I'm Taladin Ukta, owner of Cornrows & Company, a natural hair care salon in Washington, D.C. I also won my right to open a braiding salon when IJ litigated for my rights more than 20 years ago. Now, IJ is bringing 3 new lawsuits to continue that fight.
My name is Nivea Earl. I am a natural hair braider in the state of Arkansas. I have been braiding since I was a teenager in high school. I have always had a passion for braiding. The cosmetology board is saying that it's illegal for me to braid hair. The cosmetology board wants me to go to cosmetology school for 1,500 hours for thousands of dollars, and they do not teach hair braiding. It does not involve cutting people's hair or chemicals. It is perfectly safe. I would like to see the laws in Arkansas change so that I can earn an honest living.
Government can't license something as safe and common as hair braiding, especially when that license requires thousands of dollars for hundreds of hours of completely irrelevant training.
Being an entrepreneur is me living my dream. It is me fulfilling my passion braiding hair.
Nivea is the latest in a long line of braiders from across the country that IJ has represented to help them earn an honest living.
My name is Essence China.
My name is Isis.
And I own a natural hair salon in Phoenix, Arizona.
I've been doing natural hair in the state of Texas, particularly Dallas, since 1979.
In August of 2003, I started to call the cosmetology board and just let them know, I'm a braider, I want to be able to do natural hair and do braiding. What are your laws? And they pretty much told me, no, if you do hair, period, you're touching hair, you have to have a license. And so that's when I started the internet search. And when I came across the Institute for Justice, I was just so excited.
I teamed up with the Institute for Justice because I've been watching the work and the success stories.
When I won the case, I was elated.
Since winning, Essence has opened up a second shop and is now employing twice as many braiders. That's a story all too familiar to me. After winning my fight, my wife Pamela and I went on to train hundreds of women to braid hair and earn a living. IJ has litigated 9 braiding cases, winning 2 in court and prompting legislative victories in 6 others. Isis's case, the 9th, is currently being litigated.
This lawsuit means for me economic liberty. This today is our new civil rights movement, and it's important that we change the laws so that everybody else can be treated fairly.
To me, it makes no sense for any natural hairstylist to have to obtain a cosmetology license because, one, they're teaching something that we're not going to practice in terms of applying application of chemicals, whether it be perm or color. They also don't focus on or teach or test on natural hair care.
My dream is opening a larger facility where I can teach hair braiding. I want to be able to be a braider without the cosmetology board interfering in that.
Today, Nivea, along with 2 other braiders, has partnered with the Institute for Justice in filing 3 new lawsuits, which will mark a major milestone in the fight for braiding freedom.
I am ready for my day in court. This is not only important for me, but it will help others as well to be able to live their dreams braiding.
So thank you. Yes. I don't know. Do you exempt braiders? No specialty license for braiders? All right. Darn it. But yeah. We did have a marvelous just this week. The Nebraska Senate put on the consent calendar an exemption for braiders from the cosmetology law. So our strategy now is to sue in the state and then lobby in the next state bordering that one. So we've sued in Iowa, and we're currently suing in Iowa. We have had this kumbaya moment in Lincoln. It's a beautiful thing. So let me now take you down into the weeds of antitrust law and go from policy to how you implement better policy. And the conclusion that I'd ask you to consider is, has the Supreme Court given legislators a big enough hammer to address all the pushback that they'll get when it comes to reforming Michigan's licensing laws? So the Federal Trade Commission, since the Reagan administration, has been very skeptical about licensing laws. And what the Federal Trade Commission has thought about is, imagine if 8 members of the cosmetology board, just to pick one board, got together in a restaurant or at a country club and said, you know what, let's exclude braiders from practicing. You would say, well, that's clearly a restraint of trade. These cosmetologists can't collude in a restaurant or at a country club to keep people out. Well, what the Supreme Court has just said in this case is, even if these cosmetologists are part of the state government of Michigan and are meeting in a state office building, they can't do the same thing that I'm claiming that you see is clearly a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act when they meet in a restaurant. So the question before the United States Supreme Court, brought by the Federal Trade Commission, was, did the licensing board members in North Carolina violate the Sherman Act when they prohibited teeth whiteners from working in kiosks in malls? And more specifically is, when do board members have immunity from antitrust under a case from the 1940s called Parker v. Brown? Parker gives the sovereign, the state of Michigan, immunity from antitrust litigation. So let me just take a moment and explain that for just a second, very simply. When you decide to build a highway on the west side of town, you have made a competitive decision. It benefits the people on the west side of town. The people on the east side of town are competitively worse off. What Parker says is that you, Mr. State Legislator, cannot be sued for your decision to build the highway on the west side of town. You are immune even if it benefits the west siders and hurts the east siders. So and the reason is because Parker recognized the concept of federalism, that states make these competitive decisions all the time, and they are subject to voters. Voters can throw out people who excessively benefit one side of town versus another side of town. So here are the facts. Dentists in North Carolina started offering teeth whitening in the 1990s, and so did 8 of the 10 board members on the state licensing board. In 2003, non-dentists started showing up in shopping malls, and like every new entrance, what did they do? They competed on price. They were charging lower prices. The licensed dentists began to complain, and very few of the complaints dealt with quality. A lot of complaints dealt with the fact that these kiosks operating teeth whiteners were charging lower prices. Few complaints warned about harm. What did the board do? It sent out 47 cease and desist letters, and it put these kiosks operating teeth whiteners out of business. The Supreme Court said, whoa, wait a second. You've lost your sovereign immunity, Mr. Licensing Board member. The Federal Trade Commission wins. Non-sovereign actors, licensing boards, controlled by active market participants, licensees, licensed dentists, enjoy Parker State immunity from federal antitrust liability only when The restraint on competition imposed by the licensees is clearly articulated in policy. And in North Carolina, the Practice Act did not say that teeth whitening was the practice of dentistry. And that the board is actively supervised by the sovereign. No more rogue boards, no more boards acting independently, no more boards deciding what their policies are, promulgating rules independently, no more boards doing disciplinary actions against non-licensees and licensees independently. So the holding is, when states use licensees, and licensees control the board must have a clear articulation of the displacement of competition, and that must be inherently logical and followed by the board. The board's action must follow the legislature's mandate of displacing competition, and that the board must be actively supervised by the sovereign. State agencies are different from state legislators. State agencies now are not simply sovereign actors entitled to immunity because they are part of the state. In order to reestablish sovereign immunity, they must follow clearly articulated policies and be actively supervised. Parker immunity requires more than a mere facade of state involvement. So what boards are most vulnerable? Those that are standalone, those that are outside the Department of Commerce, the Department of Labor, those in which the board members control and have captured and are acting independently with little or no oversight. Those that are engaged in non-core services, where they are stopping people from working beyond the text of the Practice Act. And boards focused not on consumer protection, but on reducing competition and protecting licensees. So here are some legislative solutions. Establish a sunrise and sunset process. Before you enact a new license, make sure you really need a new license. On the sunset side, make all the licenses expire automatically after 5 years, unless the legislature renews them. And maybe in the sunrise or the sunset, you don't choose licensing if you want to go forward, but you choose a less restrictive type of regulation. Satisfy existing licensing requirements through additional means as opposed to formal education. Allow licenses to be gotten by apprenticeships. Reduce the personal qualifications. I think, Jared, you told me that Michigan used to be 2,000 hours to be a barber, now it's 1,800. That's going in the right direction. It should go more. Further. Increase reciprocity and recognition of licenses from other states. In the state of Minnesota, we are surrounded by 5 states that are part of the Nurses Compact. But Minnesota is not part of a Nurses Compact. It makes you wonder why Minnesota is not part of the Nurses Compact, and whether it has anything to do with health and safety, or is it a product of lobbying so as to protect the strength of a strike or the threat of a strike against a hospital. Convert licenses to less restrictive regulations in a pyramid. Replace licensing with state-run accreditations like the state of Indiana did last year, where it now recognizes private certification. And enact IJ's Model Act in response to the North Carolina Dental Board. Oh, repeal licenses, that's also good. All right, so I think I'll stop here before I go into some of the details about our model legislation and invite your questions, your comments, your criticism about what I've presented in terms of some of the problems with licensing as well as some of the solutions that might exist. Yes, sir.
Well, I have a question about the dental board case.
Yep.
I certainly understand that when you have a dental board comprised of dentists,
Yes.
you're going to restrict competition. But after this case, to keep the antitrust exemption, you'll get dental boards that are not filled with dentists.
Right.
The problem I see with that is if there aren't dentists on the board, you're going to get a panel full of busybodies. You're going to get Elizabeth Warren and Ralph Nader, and they're going to be just as anti-competitive as the dentists were, but they're also going to impose other requirements on dentists, which raise costs of dental care. They're going to say, oh, do a month pro bono, this, that, the other thing. It seems to me that if you're going to have a regulatory board, a board that's captured by the people being regulated is probably the best of the bad options, because I just, the other way doesn't sound any better to me.
Okay, well, that's a well asserted point. So in October, the Federal Trade Commission issued some guidance about this, and one of the things that it went after, not exactly on point, which is to your observation about who gets drawn to boards, but it said that numbers don't matter. Converting a board with 8 licensees and 1 public member to a board with 5 public members and 4 licensees isn't a magic bullet. That doesn't resolve doesn't create immunity from antitrust. So you can't fix this problem in Michigan and elsewhere by reshuffling the type of person on the board. Now, I think that speaks slightly to your second observation about who gets on the board. And so my suggestion would not be for legislators to engage in this massive turnover of licensees who's sitting on the board, but instead go to repeal or go to higher level on the inverted pyramid, because only licensing subjects you to a loss of antitrust immunity. Every other type of regulation on that pyramid does not trigger a loss of antitrust immunity. Yes, sir.
If you take technical trades, boiler operators,
Yep.
Electricians, plumbers, water plant operators, or something like truckers required to have CDLs, what would be your proposal for addressing those conditions as they exist?
Okay. So one proposal when it comes to the trades is to do inspections, and many municipalities do both. They both have competency cards and inspections. I think that's excessive. I think the periodic inspection is beneficial. Additionally, you have to recognize that the general contractor or the company owner has a real interest in the quality of his work, and that competition will be very beneficial to ensuring that the quality of the work is maintained, and the skills of the employee are sufficient to do that work. The threat of a loss of reputation is really, really, really powerful. Now, I know there is always the threat of a house blowing up, right? A bad boiler or something like that. But my suggestion is to think about this in a hard way. In that today, houses blow up, and there are higher costs and fewer jobs. So it's not that I'm offering utopia. I'm offering something that I think is better. My solution doesn't eliminate the chance of the house blowing up. It just says there are more jobs, competition works better, reputation works better, and there are more competitive services. So I don't I try not to present my ideas as being a guarantee that the world doesn't have bad things happen. I'm engaged in a balancing between costs and benefits.
We have time for one more question if anyone has a final question.
Jack.
Should I use that for the TV?
Yes.
You mentioned certification. We've had several bills introduced in Michigan the last few years that were brought to legislators by wannabe rent-seeking certifying organizations.
Yes.
Out of the blue, that are arising and trying to get these certification mandates. The bills always have a little clause in there, or other rent-seeking certifying organizations certification would work too, but that's a cover story. Your comment on that?
No, Jack, I think that is real, and I think the concern, and it's a good point. The perfect world is when you have, a better world is when you have competing certifying organizations, and their reputation is easily discernible by consumers. Most important, however, is to be vigilant. In that certification oftentimes is the nose and the camel's nose under the tent. And so legislators have to protect against certification just being a pretext for licensing next session. And so I think as long as the legislators are understanding the enormity of this institute of licensing in the marketplace, the importance of it as preventing people from pursuing their careers, the effects that it has on consumers, then I think vigilance will apply, and those sorts of problems can be defeated.
Thanks for coming. Let's give Lee a round of applause for his
thank you.
presentation. Next month, if you had fun at this one, next month we'll be having another one of these. Our next I&I forum will be on regulating ride sharing. So organizations like Uber and Lyft, we have competing bills in our state house and state senate, so we're going to be talking about some of those issues and the economics around it, as well as a panel featuring Uber drivers. And then up in Midland, the Mackinac Center is going to be partnering with Northwood University for 2 events. One will be February 23rd, and that will be on the Flint water crisis and challenges of city infrastructure. And the other will be March 14th, which will be a screening of the film from the Acton Institute, Poverty, Inc. Thank you for coming. We appreciate you either coming in person or streaming in, and please join us in the future. Thanks.